England, 1943. The airfield slept under a gray morning sky, the kind of color that blurred smoke and cloud into one long bruise. A storm had passed during the night, leaving puddles of oil-slick rainwater glinting between hangars. Engines coughed to life somewhere down the line, mechanical growls breaking the silence of dawn. When the P-47 Thunderbolt came in, everyone thought it would crash. It limped over the hedgerows at barely 100 feet, one wing trailing smoke, the propeller wobbling like a broken compass needle. The landing gear jammed halfway down. For a second, it looked like it would fold into the mud. But it didn't. It skidded, bounced twice, and somehow stopped. Half machine, half miracle. Crewmen ran toward it through the steam and fuel haze. The pilot, Captain Robert Smith, climbed out with trembling hands and a face gray with exhaustion. The right side of his fuselage was torn open, the cowling blackened, holes punched straight through the engine block. He tore off his gloves, still shaking. "Half the cylinders are gone," he said hoarsely. "Oil pressure at 0. I don't know how it kept turning." When they pushed the cowling open, everyone froze. The radial engine looked like it had been chewed apart by artillery. A third of the pistons were shattered. The coolant lines were open wounds leaking black. And yet, even now, faint heat pulsed through the metal, a low mechanical heartbeat that refused to die. Sergeant Jack Mitchell stood a few feet away, wiping his hands on a rag that was already more oil than cloth. He didn't say a word. He'd worked on this particular aircraft, White 47B, for the past 2 nights straight, barely sleeping, tightening and retightening bolts until his knuckles bled. Captain Smith turned to him. "I don't know what you did to her, Mitchell," he said, still catching his breath. "But this thing should have fallen out of the sky 300 miles ago." Jack just shrugged. Guess she didn't want to. That afternoon, the official report went up the chain of command. Aircraft sustained catastrophic engine damage. Returned safely to base. Cause of continued operation unknown. Unknown. The word bothered him, because Jack knew exactly what had kept that plane alive. A few weeks earlier, against every regulation in the book, he'd made a change to the cooling system. Something small, a valve modification no one had asked for, that nobody was supposed to notice. At the time, his crew chief had called it tinkering. Jack called it insurance. The next day, he watched as the damaged P-47 was rolled into Hangar 12. Sunlight filtered through the broken skylight, turning the air into a fog of gold dust and smoke. The smell of burnt oil hung everywhere. Mechanics circled the wreck like surgeons around a patient who shouldn't have survived. Jack knelt beside the engine. His fingers traced the bullet holes along the cylinder heads, the jagged scars of shrapnel. Every rational part of him said it was impossible. No lubrication system could run dry for 40 minutes and still bring a man home. No machine could lose half its heart and keep beating. But there it was. Warm. Alive. Later that evening, Captain Smith stopped by the maintenance shed. He brought 2 cups of coffee that tasted like gasoline and said quietly, "They're calling it luck, you know." "Luck doesn't hold pressure," Jack replied. The captain studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You sound like a man who knows something you shouldn't." Jack didn't answer. Outside, the sky had turned the color of steel. In the distance, another flight of Thunderbolts roared off the runway, their silver bellies catching the last light before vanishing into cloud. The war would take them across the channel, into another day of fire and smoke. Inside the hangar, Jack stood over his tools, his shadow falling across the next engine waiting for repair. He touched the metal, cold and solid under his hands. He knew what he'd done wasn't regulation, but it worked. He looked up at the rows of silent aircraft, lined like sleeping beasts, and whispered to himself, "If I can keep one more of you alive, maybe that's enough." No one else heard him. The wind howled through the hangar doors, carrying the scent of rain and hot fuel. Somewhere far off, anti-aircraft fire crackled faintly over the channel. Tomorrow, more planes would go out. Some would come back. Some wouldn't. But tonight, under the flicker of a single work lamp, Sergeant Jack Mitchell kept working, wrench in hand, sleeves rolled, eyes fixed on a piece of machinery that shouldn't exist, and yet somehow did. Everyone else thought it was a miracle. Jack knew better. It was a secret. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. July 1943, night in Hangar 12. Rain ticked on the corrugated roof. a metronome for nerves that wouldn't quit. The air smelled of solvent and damp canvas. A single bulb swung on its cord, smearing light over benches and the hulking curve of an R-2800. Beyond the field, the guns in France grumbled like weather, and the radio on the shelf muttered headlines about Sicily in a clipped BBC voice. Sergeant Jack Mitchell had the cowl ring off and the baffles laid out like ribs. He worked with the patience of a thief. On the bench sat parts that did not exist in any manual: 2 machine check valves, a short run of armored hose, and a Y-block scavenged from a grounded Boston. Together, they made a bypass to keep oil circulating even if flak shredded a primary line, bleeding pressure from the gallery long enough to keep pistons alive. "Mitchell," said Master Sergeant Doyle from the doorway, "you don't have authority to re-engineer a Pratt and Whitney." Jack didn't look up. "Authority's for peacetime. This is for getting Smith home. If this plumbing bursts, you turn a motor into a grenade, and me into a defendant." Jack held up the little valve, its spring bright as a fishbone. "If a line's hold, it fails anyway. This gives the oil another path. It buys minutes." Doyle rubbed his brow, then closed the door against the rain. "Minutes aren't worth a court-martial. They're worth a life." Silence, except for rain and the radio whispering Agrigento, Gela, Licata. Finally, Doyle exhaled. "You put it on your head, not mine. Tie her down and test at 45 inches. If she hiccups, you pull it and we never speak again." They bolted the engine to the run-up stand behind the hangar, sandbags stacked like a trench. Jack primed the system, bled air from the line, then thumbed the starter. The radial turned once, twice, and caught. 12 cylinders drumming. Oil pressure climbed, settled, held. He eased the throttle forward. The needle dipped as the bypass cracked open, then steadied as the auxiliary loop carried the load. At 45 inches the stacks threw blue flame. Jack pushed to 52, then 55, listening for protest. When a lace of oil traced the cowling seam, Doyle flinched, then saw it was the weep hole venting. The gauge stayed rock solid. They cut power. The night rushed back in. Doyle leaned on the stand and stared at the Y-block as if it had insulted him. "Regulation says no unauthorized alterations." "Regulation doesn't fly," Jack said, wiping his hands. "Pilots do. Pilots die when mechanics get clever. Pilots die when engines starve." He waited for the storm. It didn't come. Doyle turned the valve in his big hand and pocketed it like contraband. "1 aircraft. 1 week. If it sneezes, you're off engines and on latrines till Christmas. Deal." For the first installation, he chose White 47B, the hangar queen with a history of oiling hot. He routed the armored hose along the firewall, safety wired the fittings until his fingers bled, and chalked a tiny dot on the pump cover only he would notice. Buttoned up, the Thunderbolt looked ordinary again. 2 nights later, under a sky scrubbed by wind, they ran the squadron for dawn ops. Jack stood at the edge of the ramp as Smith swung 47B into line. The engines rose in staggered chords. Somewhere down the row a backfire cracked like a rifle. Jack watched his oil stain vanish into the half-light and felt, for the first time in months, that he had put a finger on the scale. No one thanked him. No one knew. That was fine. The only vote that mattered would come from a needle under a shaking glove at 10,000 feet, when the world turned red and the lines went empty. By midnight, the rain returned. Jack cleaned the bench, logged the hours he couldn't prove, and killed the light. As he closed the door, the field phone rang, a hard, insistent jangle. Doyle lifted the receiver, listened, then looked at Jack and said, very softly, "Group wants your name." "Okay." August 1943, northern France. The sky was a furnace. The clouds glowed orange from below, where the rail yards burned. Through the smoke, a dozen P-47 Thunderbolts swept low over the French countryside, engines screaming under full power. It was supposed to be a clean run, hit the supply lines near Rouen, and get back across the channel before sunrise. But nothing in war ever went as written. Lieutenant Tom Harris led the second flight, his voice crackling over the radio. "Bridge hit. Repeat, bridge hit. Pulling up." Static drowned the rest. A heartbeat later, flak burst above them like black flowers. The sky shook. In Hangar 12, hours later, Sergeant Jack Mitchell stood by the radio table, grease still under his nails, listening to the operations officer count the names. 11 of 12 returned. The missing man, Harris. The same Harris whose plane Jack had serviced that morning. He remembered the pilot's easy grin, the way he had patted the nose of his Thunderbolt like a horse before takeoff. Then, another voice came through the static. "Base, this is 247, losing oil pressure. Taking hits. Engines on fire. Requesting vectors." The line went dead. Outside, the night smelled of kerosene and ozone. Mechanics turned their faces to the sky, searching for something they couldn't see. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then a faint drone, uneven, limping, but real. Spotlights flared. Over the runway came a broken silhouette trailing smoke, wobbling, refusing to die. "He's coming in too fast," someone shouted. The Thunderbolt slammed onto the tarmac, skidded, spun halfway around, and stopped. The propeller blades bent like ribbon. The canopy flew open. Tom Harris was alive. Barely. Jack ran to the wreck, heat blistering his face. Oil poured from the cowling, thick and black. "Pressure zero," Harris gasped. "Should have cooked itself 20 minutes ago." They cut the engine. Even as it died, it coughed once, like a final breath, and went still. For the next hour, the hangar turned into an operating theater. Mechanics stripped the motor apart while officers hovered like anxious doctors. Jack found his mark, the small bypass valve gleaming under a crust of soot. The secondary line had burst clean through, but the valve had held. Oil had kept moving, just enough to keep the pistons alive. Doyle arrived with a clipboard and a face like stone. "That you're doing?" he asked. Jack nodded. "Then congratulations," Doyle said quietly. "You just changed the spec sheet of AU's Army Air Force's engine." He meant it half as praise, half as a warning. By morning, the word had already reached 8th Air Force Command. A test team came down from Bovingdon, 3 officers in crisp uniforms who looked at everything as if it were evidence. They asked questions. What was modified? Who authorized it? Why did it work? Jack answered as best he could, trying not to sound like a man who had broken a dozen regulations. When they finished, the youngest of them, a major with dark circles under his eyes, said, "You understand this is going to be replicated. Every maintenance depot west of London will be looking at your design." Jack only nodded. If it keeps them flying, they can have it. That night, after the officers left, he sat alone beside the engine stand. The smell of burnt oil clung to his clothes. He could still hear Harris's voice over the radio, half fear, half disbelief. Losing oil pressure. Taking hits. Engines on fire. The hangar was quiet now. Only the ticking of cooling metal broke the silence. Jack thought about how many more pilots might come home because of a part that shouldn't exist. He also thought about how long it would take before someone higher up decided to take the credit or the blame. A paper slid under the door. A teletype message from headquarters. He unfolded it with trembling hands. Field Modification 47 be authorized for controlled duplication under supervision of Air Technical Service Command. Effective immediately. Sergeant J. Mitchell to report for briefing at Duxford. Jack read it twice, then laughed softly, a tired, unbelieving sound. Duxford. The big leagues. Outside, dawn broke pale and cold over the runway. Engines began to warm again, echoing across the field. Another day, another mission. He looked at his stained hands, black with oil and graphite, and whispered, "Guess it's official now." Behind him, the repaired Thunderbolt sat silent, its patched skin gleaming faintly in the new light. A machine that shouldn't have survived, and a man who refused to believe in miracles. Tomorrow, he'd be on a train to Duxford. But tonight, for the first time, Jack allowed himself to rest, just long enough to hear the next flight take off and fade into the distance. He didn't know it yet, but the war had found its new weapon, not in a laboratory or a factory, but in the mind of one exhausted sergeant with a wrench and too much imagination. October 1943, England Wright Field, Ohio. The lamp on the squadron desk flickered in the damp air. Outside, the line of P-47s cooled in silence, ticking like clocks left out in the rain. Group Captain Ellery read the maintenance file again, lips pressed thin. Field Modification 47B, Oil System Bypass. Multiple survivals attributable. A single sentence was underlined. Engine continued to run despite total line rupture. He signed without ceremony. "Forward immediately to right field," he said. The adjutant sealed the folder, stamping the red mark, Air Priority. In the hangar, Sergeant Jack Mitchell watched as a crated R-2800 engine, his experiment, was loaded into a truck bound for the coast. Doyle handed him a carbon copy of the paperwork. "You just sent your handwriting across the Atlantic," he muttered. "Then let's hope it can swim," Jack said. The crate traveled by convoy through storms and submarine shadows. Inside, the oil-stained drawings sweated through their envelopes. In Washington, clerks shuffled them from jeep to elevator until the package reached Ohio, Wright Field, the heart of American aviation science. The test cell was colder than a church. Engineers in oil-spotted coveralls stood beside officers who looked carved from brass. On the table lay Jack's schematic, corners burned by coffee, lines uneven but alive. The senior engineer, a man with gray oil under his nails, murmured, "If this works, we change the manual. If it fails, we'll be jokes for years." They mounted the engine, primed it, and hit the starter. The R-2800 woke with a roar that shook dust from the rafters. Gauges trembled. The needle for oil pressure steadied, then dropped sharply as a valve was opened to simulate battle damage. The room held its breath. The bypass clicked once, quietly, and the needle froze halfway down, stable. No one spoke. Only the steady thrum of a machine refusing to die. "Take it higher," the colonel ordered. More throttle, more vibration, still steady. The trace on the chart drew a perfect horizontal line. The old engineer smiled for the first time that morning. "It holds." They pushed further, sabotaged lines, dirt in the filters, a mock shell burst. Each time, the same impossible result. The system bled, but lived. When they shut it down, the motor ended on its own terms, not from failure, but from discipline. In the debriefing room, a stenographer typed while steam rose from untouched coffee. "Authorize Field Modification 47B," dictated the colonel. "Initiate standardization under supervision." Someone hesitated. "We're approving a sergeant's guess." Another replied, "We're approving what works." The pen came down. Ink turned rebellion into regulation. The report reached Washington within days. Procurement wanted production numbers. Legal asked who held the patent. Public Affairs asked whose name would appear in the release. Nobody mentioned Jack Mitchell. His signature on the sketch was already photocopied into anonymity. At Wright Field, technicians dismantled the test engine. The bypass valve, just a small brass Y-piece with a spring inside, sat on the bench between a micrometer and a sandwich wrapper. A junior engineer labeled it 47B, Field Origin. By sunset, teletypes clattered across offices. Adopt modification for all R-2800 combat units. Implementation immediate. The miracle was now official. But miracles, once approved, turn into paperwork. In Washington, the first question appeared, typed in neat capitals at the bottom of a memo. Who receives credit, and who accepts liability if failure occurs? Wright Field had certified a simple idea born in a muddy English hangar. But even as the ink dried, the same thought whispered through every corridor of command. A soldier's invention had crossed an ocean, and now the system would decide who it belonged to. November 1943 to February 1944, Washington, D.C., /Pratt and Whitney plants /airbases in England. In Washington, the air smelled of ink, smoke, and indecision. Piles of reports covered the mahogany tables in the War Department's technical boardroom. The folder stamped 47B modification sat open like a wound. Colonel Avery read aloud, "Field valve bypass, operational under extreme damage. Proven in test." His tone made it sound like a crime. Across from him, a representative from Pratt and Whitney smoothed his tie. "With respect, Colonel, our engines are tested for thousands of hours. This field fix violates every tolerance we've set." Avery leaned forward. "And yet it works. You've seen the data." The man's jaw tightened. "It's undocumented. Unapproved. If a single aircraft crashes." The colonel cut him off. "If we wait, more will crash. Which report would you rather sign?" The room went silent, save for the steady buzz of the overhead fan. Outside, snow began to fall over Constitution Avenue, thin flakes vanishing before they hit the pavement. Weeks later, in Hartford, Connecticut, engineers at Pratt and Whitney's main plant examined Mitchell's modified engine like priests handling contraband scripture. One of them, a thin man with round spectacles, traced the valve's curve with his finger. "A farmer could have built this," he muttered. "That's the point," replied another. "A farmer did. Only he happened to wear sergeant stripes." Internal memos flew back and forth between factories, laboratories, and command offices. Some urged restraint. Do not authorize change without full analysis. Others carried a different tone. P-47 loss rates unsustainable. Implement field modification immediately. By December, the argument stopped being theoretical. A squadron report from England arrived with photographs. 3 P-47s, riddled with shrapnel, all returned safely. The oil lines hung open like severed veins, but the engines had survived. Scribbled on the margin in pencil, 47B installed. The photo landed on the desk of General Hap Arnold himself. He looked at it, sighed, and wrote 2 words at the bottom: "Do it." Factories moved before the ink dried. In Brooklyn, production foremen were woken past midnight by phone calls from Washington. "Shift the line," they were told. "We're adding a new valve." No one had the full blueprints, only a rough schematic copied from a grease-stained drawing. But the message was clear: speed over certainty. A machinist named Lou Carbone, who had spent 20 years building automobile parts, watched the first batch take shape under his hands. "It ain't pretty," he told his crew, "but if it keeps one kid from burning up over France, it's worth the sweat." The work continued through the holidays. Sparks flew, drills screamed, and the factory never slept. By January, crates stamped R 2800 modified began to roll out under the yellow lights of the shipping yard. Men in heavy coats guided them toward freight cars bound for the docks. Somewhere under the snow, the city pulsed like a living engine. Back in Washington, lawyers and engineers now shared the same long table. Someone asked, "Who's responsible if this thing fails?" Another voice answered, "The man who built it, and the men who ordered it." Nobody mentioned the name Mitchell. To the files, he was simply field source. By February 1944, the modified engines reached the depots in England. Mechanics tore open the crates with crowbars, marveling at the small brass part that had traveled halfway around the world. "This?" one of them said. "This little thing's the miracle." Jack Mitchell wasn't there to see it. He was still repairing what others broke. But word filtered back through pilots' letters: fewer maydays, more returns, less smoke on the horizon. His idea, stripped of his name, had begun to save lives. In Hartford, a corporate report quietly rephrased history. Revised oil system improvements developed under wartime field cooperation between manufacturer and U.S. Army technical units. It sounded official. It also sounded nothing like the truth. The engineers who had fought against it now celebrated it. The colonel who had argued for it was promoted. The factory workers went back to building engines by the thousands. And somewhere across the Atlantic, mechanics fitted the first production valves onto combat aircraft, unaware that the war had just become slightly less deadly. Still, in a memo dated February 28th, a single line appeared under outstanding issues. Performance stable. Approval universal. Origin disputed. For the bureaucrats, that was the end of the matter. For the men at the front, it was only the beginning. The machines were ready, but nobody yet knew how they'd perform when fire met steel in the sky. Spring, summer 1944, England and the skies over France. Dawn crept pale over the airfield at Leiston. The grass glittered with frost, the concrete with oil. Mechanics moved like ghosts around the hulking silhouettes of P-47s and P-51s. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang once, swallowed by the thunder of warming engines. The day's mission was written in chalk on a board: escort, 8th Bomber Command, target, Rouen Rail Yards. Sergeant Jack Mitchell watched the pilots walk out, helmets swinging from their hands. He had spent the night fitting the latest batch of modified R2800s, his valve now factory-born, stamped, and serial numbered. Still, each time he tightened one into place, he whispered the same thing under his breath: "Hold together, you bastard." The sky was hard blue when they took off, a rising swarm of silver wings climbing into the sun. Within an hour, they crossed the channel, engines humming at perfect rhythm. From below, they looked untouchable. From inside, every man knew better. Over France, black puffs of flak blossomed like flowers of smoke. The radio filled with clipped voices, red lead hit. "I'm losing oil pressure," Fire in number 2. One of the P-47s took a burst through its cowling. The pilot, Lieutenant Harris, felt the stick shudder as his pressure gauge sank toward 0. "I'm cooked," he said. Command answered, "Bail out if you can." But Harris stayed with it, hand on the throttle. The seconds crawled. Then, impossibly, the needle steadied halfway down the dial. "I don't know how," he said, breathing hard. "But she's still running." He turned for the coast. Back at base, they heard his engine before they saw him. A rough, uneven growl like a wounded animal refusing to die. When the wheels touched the runway, the propeller was barely turning. Mitchell was already waiting, wrench in hand. He climbed onto the wing before the engine stopped spinning. Oil poured down the fuselage like blood, yet the block hadn't seized. He touched the brass valve, blackened and hot. It had done its job. That evening, the operations tent buzzed with the kind of silence only soldiers understand. The mechanics huddled around the maintenance logs, reading the damage reports like scripture. 3 aircraft had returned with ruptured lines and failed seals, and all 3 had landed alive. Doyle broke the quiet. "We're not fixing engines anymore," he said softly. "We're fixing luck." But the luck was measurable. In April, the number of planes lost to engine failure fell by nearly a third. By May, bomber crews began calling their fighter escorts the Unkillables. Pilots believed in the valve the way sailors believe in a lucky charm. One wrote home, "They say our engines don't quit anymore. Maybe someone up there made a deal." The Germans noticed, too. Luftwaffe pilots reported that American fighters were staying in the fight longer, even with visible oil trails. "They burn," one German ace wrote, "but they do not fall." Still, no miracle came free. The constant power strain made some engines overheat, and mechanics had to learn new ways to service them. There were accidents, fires on the ground, even one explosion during testing. But overall, the machines lived longer than they should, and men lived because of them. In June, during the first missions supporting the Normandy invasion, the new engines proved their worth again. P-51 Mustangs escorted B-17s through heavy flak, taking hits that once would have doomed them. One pilot, his oil pressure collapsing, still managed to reach the English coast before bailing out. He sent a message later. "Tell whoever made that fix, he bought me 20 minutes. That's the difference between the channel and the sea floor." Mitchell read the note at his workbench. For a long moment, he didn't move. The hangar buzzed around him, wrenches clattering, orders shouted, but he just stared at the paper. He wanted to feel pride, but what he felt instead was exhaustion, and the quiet fear that the machine he'd saved might someday outlive the men it was built to protect. That night, while the rest of the crew slept, he walked between the rows of grounded fighters, their wings glinting faintly under the moon. The metal still radiated heat from the day's flight. He touched one fuselage, felt the faint vibration of cooling pistons, and whispered, "You've done your part. Now let them rest." At dawn, the siren for another mission wailed. Mechanics scrambled back to work. Engines coughed to life, one after another, until the field trembled with sound. The war rolled forward, relentless. Mitchell watched the first squadron rise into the morning haze, and for a brief moment, the noise faded. He realized what haunted him most wasn't the idea that his invention might fail, but that it might never fail again. Spring, summer 1944, ETO, under a desk lamp. Paper dust floated in the cone of light like snow that refused to land. The squadron commander, Group Captain Ellery, pinned a flimsy to a clipboard and read aloud to the room of tired officers. Comparative return rates, March versus May. Pre-47B. Aircraft returning with major oil system damage, 18%. Post-47B, 41%. He paused. The radiator hissed. No one spoke. Numbers like that didn't shout. They burrowed under the skin. A second sheet, stamped confidential, listed engine seizures by month. A column of steady gray bars, then a sudden dip like a stair breaking. At the bottom someone had typed. All other variables held constant to extent possible. It was the closest the war ever got to saying miracle in a memo. Ellery set the pages down as if they might crack. "There's a name in these reports," he said, and his voice softened. "Sergeant J. Mitchell." He looked toward the open door, where the hangar's draft pushed cold air across the floor. "Find him," he told the adjutant. "Have him stand for recognition at the next parade." They found Jack on the line, elbows deep in a cowling, wrench wedged against a stubborn B-nut. "Parade?" he said, not looking up. "Sir, with respect, my lads have 3 ships to turn by dawn." Ellery kept his tone formal. "You're to be commended." Jack tightened once more until the fitting squealed. "I'm just doing my job." He meant it. The commander let the silence rest, then nodded once and left him to the work that had made the numbers true. Back under the lamp, Ellery initialed another sheet. Pilot statements, selected. The first came from a lieutenant who had landed with a hole the size of a fist where his oil line used to be. "Something kept the pressure up long enough to get me home," he'd written in a cramped hand. "Not an angel. A valve." The next was from a Mustang driver who escorted crippled bombers through flak. "I watched my gauge die, then stop dying. Without that, I'm a name on a wall you haven't built yet." The public relations officer folded those quotes into a clean paragraph for reporters. He trimmed the grease, the fear, the jokes, left only something the home front could swallow. When a correspondent from London asked the saved lieutenant what he owed his life to, the man said into the microphone, "A little brass part and the men who fit it." The sentence aired at supper time between speeches and ration tips. In the hangar, someone turned up the wireless, listened, and went back to tightening safety wire. The data grew heavier by the week. Depot summaries showed fewer forced landings in friendly fields, more full recoveries to base. The 8th Air Force headquarters grafted into confidence, an uptick in aggressiveness for escorts, fewer quick turnbacks at the first leak. Commanders began to plan with the expectation that a wounded fighter might still shepherd a formation home. Strategy quietly shifted because a needle on a gauge no longer fell as fast. Yet every column of saved machines threw a shadow. In Washington, marginal notes bloomed beside the good news: credit allocation, field liability, kit standardization across variants. Lawyers asked whose authorization covered installations done on muddy ramps at midnight. Engineers argued about fatigue cycles under partial lubrication. A colonel circled the word works and wrote, "At what long-term cost?" On base, the questions were different. Doyle, the master sergeant, ran his finger down a tally of returns and whispered, "We're stealing men back from the sea." Then he flipped the sheet and pointed to the bottom line: overtime, accidents on the ground, fire incidents during run-up. "The bill's here, too." Ellery tried again to pin a ribbon on the man the spreadsheets kept naming. Jack refused again, more gently this time. "Sir, give it to the kid who loads my trucks in the rain. Give it to the lad who lost a thumb and came back the next day to torque cylinder heads. The valves don't fit themselves." Ellery laughed despite himself. "That's not how ceremony works. It's how engines work," Jack said. One afternoon, a staff officer from Duxford arrived with a leather folder and a photographer who smelled of flash powder. He asked Jack to hold a pristine example of 47B up to the camera. Jack did, then tucked it into a pocket of his coveralls and went back to a misfiring magneto. The photo later appeared in a circular with the caption, "Standardized Kit, ETO." No name beneath. In the margin of a copy pinned above the tool crib, someone penciled, "Mitch made it." Someone else underlined "made." The summer thickened. Heat warped the air above the runway. Bees drifted in engine-warm shadows. Reports still came, now with tables neat enough to convince even skeptics. Pre-mod engine failure RTB rate, 1 in 5. Post-mod, 2 in 5. Not invincible, just better odds. The kind of math men could live inside. In the mess, a pilot set his tray down across from Jack and said, without preamble, "You don't know me, but your idea gave me 20 more minutes today." He drew a rectangle on the table with his fingertip. "Here to here. Long enough to clear the coast." He didn't smile. Gratitude seldom looks happy. Jack nodded and said, "Glad you brought her back," because anything larger would have broken in his throat. The evening courier bag brought fresh contradictions. A cable from Washington asking again about formal credit. A depot circular warning of copycat parts machined without proper springs. A typed note from right field requesting field feedback on wear. The empire of paper expanded, shadowing the very hangar it described. Back under the lamp, Ellery signed 3 more requisitions and shut his eyes for the count of 5. When he opened them, the numbers were still there, steady as gauges. Fewer flames on final approach, fewer black plumes on the horizon, fewer empty hooks in the locker room. Proof, not gossip. proof in digits that didn't care who got a medal. He reached for the phone. "Mitchell," he said when the line clicked alive, "one more adjustment. Flight at dawn. Can you give me a margin?" On the other end, Jack wiped his hands on a rag gone shiny with use. "Always," he said. And he hung up, turned back to the open cowling, and made a small change that wouldn't appear in any table but might tilt a day, a life, a map. The front said, "It works." Washington said, "Who signs?" And in the hangar, with the night leaning against the doors, Jack tightened one last fitting, because one more pilot still had to come home. Summer, autumn 1944, over Germany and inside the enemy's mind. The air above northern Germany shimmered with heat and metal. Contrails clawed at the blue, white scars twisting over the Ruhr. Below, in a cramped office in Berlin, the Luftwaffe's technical evaluation unit crowded around a table of intercepted American reports. A captain in wire-rimmed glasses read aloud. Enemy fighters increasingly returned to base despite heavy engine damage. Cause: unknown mechanical reinforcement, likely new oil circulation system. Silence. A colonel rubbed his temple. "They used to fall when we hit them in the nose," he muttered. "Now they limp home across the channel." On a chalkboard, red lines marked each failed interception. The pattern was obvious. The longer the war dragged on, the harder the Thunderbolts and Mustangs were to kill. Then came a courier from Aachen, carrying fragments from a downed P-47, scorched metal, twisted tubing, and a small brass fitting blackened by oil and fire. The colonel held it up. This saves their planes." The engineer nodded slowly. "If it keeps the pressure steady, yes. Even a few minutes could make the difference." The brass piece went to the test lab at Rechlin. Within days, they confirmed it, a primitive but effective bypass valve. The report to headquarters read, "Enemy aircraft employ mechanical redundancy to sustain oil pressure after damage. Their engines no longer fail under partial rupture." The phrase, "no longer fail," unsettled everyone. Orders spread to the front. Avoid frontal attacks. Aim for radiators and fuel systems. A circular instructed pilots, strike beneath the cowling, low 6 o'clock, destroy their arteries, not their armor. In England, the captured circular arrived in the mail pouch of an intelligence officer. The translation made its way to Mitchell's hangar. Someone pinned it above the tool bench, underlined the words "target," the valve. Jack stared at it. "They finally noticed," he said quietly. Doyle, his friend and senior mechanic, shrugged. "Guess you're famous." That night, under dim lights, Jack and 2 crewmen moved the valve's position deeper inside the engine bay, shrouding it with new tubing. No paperwork, no orders, just necessity. The next morning, the modified planes flew. None reported failure. Meanwhile, in Dresden, a team of German engineers tried to replicate the bypass design for the FW-190. They built a crude version, a spring and a sleeve cut from spare parts. The test pilot said it might work. The next night, British bombers destroyed the workshop before it could fly. The war was erasing its own discoveries. By September, intercepted German radio messages showed growing frustration. Pilots complained that their ammunition was wasted. "They burn," one ace said bitterly, "but they do not die." The new American engines were changing morale itself. Allied pilots now dove deeper into flak, confident their machines could take punishment and still bring them home. At the same time, command statistics backed the feeling. Engine failure losses dropped by 30%. Return rates climbed. Pilots began calling the new modifications the Mitchell fix. Mechanics joked that their hangar now produced luck in liquid form. But Jack felt uneasy. "Every trick has a counter," he said one evening. Doyle looked at him. "You think they'll figure one out?" Jack nodded toward the pinned German leaflet. "They already are." In Berlin, analysts redrew attack diagrams, recalculating strike angles to bypass the protection. War had become a duel between inventors who never met. One created time, the other tried to take it away. October brought colder skies and longer missions. Over Leipzig, a P-51 took a burst through its wing root. The pilot barely made it back, the oil system spewing black smoke the entire way. When he landed, he kissed the wing and said only, "Whatever's inside there, thank it for me." Back at base, Jack heard the story and said nothing. He was proud, yes, but something heavier sat behind it. The machine he'd altered was now a weapon within a weapon, its existence pushing pilots to fly riskier, further, longer. Each success demanded another. Each miracle increased the cost of the next. A week later, another intercepted memo reached intelligence. It bore the Luftwaffe seal and a single sentence in German. Enemy employs auxiliary oil pressure recovery system known informally as Mitchell valve. When the translation was read aloud in the hangar, the men laughed and clapped him on the back. Jack smiled once, briefly. "Great," he said. "Now they'll aim for it." He didn't sleep that night. The wind rattled the hangar doors, and he sat alone beside an open engine, listening to the ticking metal cool. He realized the truth every engineer eventually meets. Every improvement becomes tomorrow's target. In the war of machines, no invention stays safe for long. Winter 1944, spring 1945, the last flights. The war was burning itself out. Over Germany, the sky looked bruised, gray, smoky, heavy with the ghosts of thousands of missions. For the crews, it no longer felt like glory or strategy, just survival. Every flight was a gamble against exhaustion and gravity. At the airfields in England, the hangars grew quieter with each passing week. Mechanics no longer shouted over engines. They murmured, working slower, their hands cracked from oil and cold. Sergeant Jack Mitchell had been one of them since the beginning. Now, orders waited on the table beside his toolbox. Reassignment, home in 30 days. "You've done your part," the commander said. But Jack wasn't sure what that meant anymore. On his last morning, he walked the line of aircraft outside the hangar. Thunderbolts, Mustangs, each one scarred by fire and patched with dull metal plates. Beneath their cowling, his valve kept the oil flowing. The numbers in the reports proved it. Fewer failures, fewer crashes. A simple brass fitting that had changed the rhythm of the war. Inside, the walls were lined with documents, statistical tables, official memos, evidence of something the papers would later call mechanical resilience improvements. But Jack never used those words. For him it was simpler, a fix that worked. One afternoon, a young pilot found him by the tool racks. "You don't know me," he said, voice hoarse from smoke. "I flew one of your mods over Castle. We took flak. Oil everywhere. I thought the engine was gone, but it kept breathing. I made it back." He hesitated. "I just wanted to say thanks." Jack nodded, unable to speak. That night, he found a letter slipped under his door. It read, "The pressure stayed. I don't know who built it, but it saved me. When this is over, I'll tell my kids about the sound that didn't stop." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his duffel, next to a wrench still stained with engine grease. Meanwhile, in Washington, the debate had already begun. In polished conference rooms, officers argued whether the Mitchell valve should enter post-war design. Some called it genius. Others dismissed it as reckless improvisation. One colonel said, "Wartime desperation isn't engineering. It's luck dressed as invention." Luck. Jack had heard that word before. He remembered filing brass by candlelight, praying it would hold just a little longer, while pilots waited on the runway. There had been no luck, only hands that refused to stop working. By March 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine. The Luftwaffe was a memory, planes without fuel, pilots without hope. But even as the front collapsed, reports from the field kept arriving. Engines limped home, fuel lines shattered but alive, valves still holding pressure long enough to land. The numbers were small, yet each one meant another man returned. When victory came, the sound that followed wasn't cheers, it was silence. The silence of motors shutting down for the last time, of hangars emptied and swept clean. Mechanics packed their tools into crates and waited for the ships that would take them home. Jack sat alone by an unmounted R-2800 engine, its propeller blackened from months of war. A fellow mechanic said softly, "You did it, Jack. You made something that lived through hell." Jack smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I just made it last a little longer." Before leaving, he placed a small metal box on the workbench. Inside lay the first valve, scratched, burned, but still intact. On the lid, he penciled 3 words. It worked. Once. Months later, a clerk at Wright Field found it and logged it in the archives. The entry read, "Unregistered oil pressure bypass device, field origin. Proven effective. Designer unknown." And so the name disappeared, buried under 1,000 other inventions that helped end the war. But his legacy didn't need a file number. It lived in the memory of pilots who crossed the channel with engines bleeding, who landed on fumes and called it a miracle. It lived in the quiet confidence that somewhere, someone had made sure their machine would not die too soon. They said one small change couldn't alter history. But sometimes history turns on a single bolt, a patch of brass, a heartbeat of pressure that refuses to fade. Because in war, victory isn't just in the machines that kill, it's in the ones that keep you alive.